Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today we've got a really fun project for you. We'll be showing you how to cast your own resin skull and make it to fit a confetti light. It's a really fun project, and it's unique to us because it doesn't require any turning. Let's go over the casting process, and I'll show you the products required to do it. You're going to need some pigments to color the epoxy resin to get whatever color you desire. We have them in some larger size containers here, and we also have a variety pack that have a bunch of different colors. And the nice thing about this stuff is you don't use a ton of the powder pigments to change the colors of your skulls or whatever you're casting. These colors are really good for making pen blanks, rings, and anything you cast in resin. The next thing is going to be our resin. This is the Alumilite Clear Slow. We've chosen this resin in particular so you have a little more work time as well as being optically clear. The work time on the resin is about 12 minutes. Depending on your temperature, it can be a little bit quicker than that. So 12 minutes work time. The demold time is 4 hours. So after you've put it in your pressure pot, 4 hours later you can go and pull these out of the mold. If it is a product that you will be turning, you're going to want to wait at least 24 hours for that resin to fully cure before you turn it, or else it'll still be a little bit soft on the inside. But it is a two-part epoxy. You have A and B sides, and it is a 1-to-1 ratio, and it needs to be exacting when you're mixing you're getting your measurements. Then we have our skull mold. This is a nice little silicone mold. It's got these little tabs on the bottom, so that way when you set it on into your pressure pot, it stays nice and flat and stable. The nice thing about this too is this silicone is pretty stretchy, so when you demold your skull, it's less likely to tear or have any issues that way. So really cool little mold. We'll also need some mold release. The mold release is used to spray the inside of the mold, so that way when the resin is cured, you can pull this off without tearing the mold or having to get stuck to the resin itself. So this is definitely a required item. I've also got my mixing cups, and I've got 3 different sizes. The nice thing with these is they have the fluid ounce measurements on the side of the cups because the resin requires a 1-to-1 ratio and it's very exacting. So you want to make sure that whatever cup or mixing cups you're using, you can measure accurately. The nice thing about these as well is they do have a pour spout, so when you're mixing colors, it doesn't make a mess. I've also got some disposable stir sticks. You're definitely going to want those to mix the resin thoroughly. I've also got some disposable shop gloves because you don't want to get this resin on your hands or anything because it does have a sensitivity allergy to it. The last thing we'll cover is our pressure pot. This is a really great pressure pot on the market. One of the best things about it is it's a turnkey system. So once you unbox it, you can plug it straight into your air hose and start using it right away. You don't have to find the gauges or the valves or the regulators or anything aftermarket. The other nice thing too is it has really heavy duty locking levers and rubber feet, which is nice when you have it on your bench top. You don't have to worry about it sliding around. It is a 2.5 gallon size. And one thing I want to show you as well, if you get your pressure pots from us, we include a wooden disc for the inside of the pressure pot. The base of it is concave, and if you put any molds in there, silicone molds in particular, they will warp slightly because it's not flat on the inside, so we include a little spacer disc to level everything out and help prevent any spillover out of your mold, as well as keep your pen blank silicone molds nice and flat. We'll get into how to use the pressure pot once we get our epoxy cast and ready to put into the mold, and we'll go over all the specs and everything, how to use it as well. Now that we're ready to cast, the first thing I want to do is pick out my colors. For this skull in particular, I want to do a 2-tone color mix. And if I look through all the pigments, I think I want to do a blue and a white blend. So I'm going to pick the iridescent blue and the pearl white. Those will be really good colors. When they mix, we'll have some pretty swirling effects to these. And I'll show you how to mix these so we can get some good color blends. Before we start doing anything, I'm going to throw on my gloves. And we want to prep our mold. Mold prep is extremely important, especially with these silicone molds, because if you don't have mold release or they're not ready to be cast into, you could damage them and you might have to throw these away. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that my mold is clean. After you cast into these a bunch of times, sometimes you have dust in there, you might have some leftover epoxy resin from your last cast. Just make sure that your mold is nice and clean and ready to go. Blow it out with an air compressor and you should be all right. The next thing we want to do is make sure we use our mold release. This stuff you just want to shake up the can, make sure it's mixed thoroughly. Doesn't take long. And when you spray this into the mold, Just a light coating is all you need. You can oversaturate this, then you have a bunch of mold release in the bottom that'll try to mix with your epoxy, and it can end up causing some weird shapes on the outside of the skull. So just a light coating is all, and about 10 to 12 inches away. That's all it takes for the mold release. That just helps us get the cast skull out of our mold. And I'll set that aside for just a moment. As far as the resin goes, when we go to mix these, we want the ratios 1:1 to be almost identical. If you do have a slightly odd mix ratio, you are going to have some frosting or hazing with the epoxy. So make sure you're as accurate as you can be. And these smaller bottles are super handy to pour out of. And I've prepped these already. I've already cut the nozzles off and opened them up. If you do use the gallon jugs, it's nice to keep these smaller bottles on hand that you can just top off, because it's nice to mix and pour out of these as compared to the gallon jugs. These just make dispensing a lot easier and getting your accurate measurements a little bit easier as well. So first thing I want to do is we'll get our equal parts A and B. We'll mix these thoroughly together in the larger container, and then we'll be separating some of the mixed resin into a smaller cup that then we can add our pigments and make sure those are mixed thoroughly separate. Once those are ready to go, we can pour them into our mold, and having those separated will give us a nice swirling effect to our skull when it's cast. All right, so let's go ahead and mix this up. The Alumilite is mixed by weight, so I'm going to get my scale. Let's turn this on, and we'll zero it with the cup. And this mold takes about 10 ounces of resin, but I like to have an ounce or two extra resin just in case I spill any or anything settles or I have a bunch of air bubbles. It's just nice to have a little extra resin than be short on resin. So let's do 6 ounces of side B. I'm going to watch the scale. And you want this to be as exact as you can. Obviously, if I go a little over 6, then we'll have to match that with side A. But these bottles, the little squeeze bottles, are really nice for getting just the exact amount of resin. All right, so I have 6 ounces of side B. Let's do our side A, and we should be right at 12 when we're done. Once I get close to my 12, I'm going to slow down and just trickle this in. Make sure we get the exact amount of resin. All right, we're at 12.1. I'm going to add just a little bit more of side B, so we're 12.2. Should only take a few drops. And then just keep an eye on your scale. And we're right on the money. So now that we have this mixed by weight, 6.1 to 6.1, I'm going to move my scale out of the way, and now we can go ahead and start mixing this up. One of the components to anytime you're casting resin is you do want to make sure that you thoroughly mix these two. Otherwise, you're going to have parts of the mold that aren't completely cured. So make sure you mix it thoroughly. Also, make sure you scrape the sides of your mixing container. Sometimes it'll be coated inside A and the B doesn't kick it over all the way, so make sure you scrape it and get this as mixed as thoroughly as possible. Also, when you're mixing this, you want to try and do it without inducing a bunch of air bubbles. But because this clear slow is fairly viscous, air bubbles come out of it pretty well. Some of the other epoxies out there are really thick and the air bubbles get stuck in there really bad. But the air bubbles we have in here are pretty small, so those will shrink down just fine under pressure. I'll give that one more scrape, a couple more swirls, and I think we'll be ready to pour this into our smaller container. All right, so I'm going to grab my smaller container and I'll use the pour spout on this to fill up just a few ounces of resin. You can go half and half, or you can do the majority of one color and then just a tiny bit of a different color to contrast. But the color mixes and choices that you want to do are completely up to you, and there's an unlimited amount of different colors and blends and swirling patterns that you can get in the resin. So it's a really fun, creative process. All right, so I'm going to start with the pearl white. I'm going to dump some of this into the cup. I'm going to set that aside for just a moment and see if I need to add more pigment once I start mixing this. The amount of the amount of pigment to resin will vary depending on the transparency or opaqueness that you want in the skull, or how densely you want that color to be saturated. So usually what I like to do is mix this up pretty well, and then I'll pick up the stir stick, and then if I can still see the wood pretty well through, I know that my skull will be kind of transparent. So I'm going to add a bit more pigment. And I don't mind if this one is slightly transparent, but I want to have some good color saturation throughout the skull as well. And make sure that that pigment's thoroughly mixed into the resin as well. Okay, that looks a lot better. We've got that really good shimmer with the pearl white. Now we'll go to our blue. All right, we'll start mixing this blue pigment in. You can see how well it colors the resin. The black diamond pigments are really popular for casting. They have really good color choices and selection, and their pigments are very vivid. You can see just how good that metallic blue looks. I think I'm going to add just a tiny bit more of the blue. And it's been about 4 minutes since we started mixing the hardener in, so I've got about 8 minutes left before I need to get this under pressure. So you do need to work rather quickly. Make sure you scrape the sides of the container to get all that pigment mixed up well. And then you can see we've got that really pretty blue. Okay, now that we have our resin mixed with the catalyst, both sides mixed well, we have our pigments mixed really well, this is ready to pour into our mold. And we'll move these out of the way for just a moment. We'll get our pot in where we need it. All right, so we've got our pot set up. We have our spacer disc we'll put in the bottom. The reason we use that is so when the mold is sitting in there, the mold is sitting nice and flat and it's not on the concave base of the pot itself. If I set that in there directly, the skull would be slightly crooked. So make sure you use your spacer disc. One other reason it's in here before we pour the resin into it is because the mold is fairly flexible. We don't want to be moving this after we have resin in it, otherwise you're going to spill it. So I'm going to start with the blue. I'll be using the pour spout, just coating the inside of the mold with some resin, and then I'll switch to my white. I'm going to switch back to my blue and try and get a little bit of a layering swirl effect. Get all the resin out of your casting cups. And then we'll finish filling this up with the pure white. Now that we have our skull cast with the resin in it, it's time to put the pressure pot lid on, get the pressure pot fired up, get it full of air pressure to reduce the size of those air bubbles, and then we'll let it sit up for 24 hours and then we can come back and demold this. First thing we want to do is get our lid on. I'll line up the tabs with the locking levers. And then go ahead and snug down these giant wing nuts. Make sure this is all snug. I'm going to make sure that my valves are closed The air release valve as well as our inlet valve, make sure those are shut. We don't want to pressure up our pot with the valve fully open, or else it'll shoot a bunch of air in there and then it's going to spray resin all over the inside of your pot. So make sure that your valves are all shut before we connect our air hose. So let me grab the air hose and we'll get this thing fired up. So we've got our air hose. This pressure pot in particular, the working pressure is 60 psi. It has a max tank pressure of 80 psi, but stay within the 60 psi limit. If you go above 80, it will have the safety valve. It will shoot a bunch of air out. That way it's a safety precaution so this thing doesn't explode. So again, make sure your valves are shut, and we'll go ahead and connect our air hose. Now that we have our air hose connected, we'll slowly open our inlet valve and just let that pressure slowly build. If we open that valve all the way, it's going to shoot the air in and spray resin everywhere. I've done that before on accident when I thought the valve was closed. So just make sure that this is shut when you plug on. And then we'll let our tank build to 60 psi, and then we can shut our air valve. All right, now that we have our pot pressured up to 60 psi, we're going to let this sit, cure for 24 hours. If you wanted to, you could pull it out after 4 hours, but we'll leave it under pressure. And the nice thing is you can disconnect your air hose because it's a sealed system, so once it's up to psi, you just let it sit. The reason we use a pressure pot is to get those air bubbles to shrink as small as they can to where you can't see them and make it look, completely solid and not have any visible air bubbles. So let's let this sit for 24 hours. Tomorrow morning we'll come back in, release the pressure, we'll open this up and demold our skull and show you how cool it looks. All right, so we've let our mold and our resin cure for 24 hours. Obviously the demold time is 4 hours, but we just let this set overnight to get fully cured. So now we can go ahead and depressure our pot, take the lid off, and then demold our skull. So first thing we need to do when we depressurize this is we'll slowly open the air release valve and just let this naturally come down to a lower pressure. Once we're back down to a 0 natural pressure on the pot, we can unscrew our wing nuts and we can take the lid off. Make sure it's fully depressurized before you loosen the wing nuts. And now we can start loosening these up, and we'll take off our lid. All right. Go ahead and put our skull to the side, move our pressure pot out of the way. So now this is what it looks like cast. The resin's nice and solid. Now we can demold this. And once we do this, I'm going to try and just get rid of any excess epoxy around the edges, because these little flat pieces are kind of sharp, so I'll just break those off and just slide them aside. That way we don't risk cutting our mold as we're trying to pull this out. And then when I demold the skull in particular, just try and work all the edges loose. Make sure there's nothing sticking. And then I'll try and demold it from the back towards the front of the skull. I found that just to be a little bit easier. All right, we've just about got this apart. Pull that out of the eye sockets where it sticks a little bit. So there's our skull. We've got a really good color blend with that blue and then the pure white. We've even got some areas where that settled a little bit and gave us some cool streaks. And we've got a really good blend. The one nice thing about this mold in particular is it's got such a smooth internal surface that when you pull your skull out of the mold, the surface is nice and highly polished and you don't have to buff it or anything. It's ready to go straight out of the mold. So the only thing I would probably do now is just get some sandpaper and soften up these edges on the bottom where it's a little bit sharp, where it met the edge of the mold. And then this is ready to go to our drill press and drill this out for our confetti light. All right, for the rest of the skull, the reason we've cast this is so we can drill out the top of the head and then put in a small confetti light. These are just a little glass candle that we're gonna fill with paraffin oil, and it makes a fun little gift when you light this on fire and you have a sweet little decoration you have. So what we need to do now is go and get our table moved out of the way, get our drill press in here, and then we can drill this out. And we'll be using an 1.5" Forstner bit. One thing you can do is you can test the fit and see how you like the confetti light to fit in. I want to be able to just drop it into the skull instead of having to be a press fit or be too tight. So I'll be using an 1.5 inch Forstner bit, and we'll get everything set up and I'll show you how to drill this out. And then we'll go ahead and fill our lamp with oil, light it on fire, and show you how cool these look. So we have our Forstner bit set up, 1.5 inch. We have that in our key chuck. We've got our skull. What we want to do now is we're going to mark our center for the Forstner bit. So I'm going to line that up between the eyes here, and then you can place that further back or forward front depending on how you want it to fit. But I'm just going to put a small black dot there where I want the center of the bit to find. I've also got my wasteboard clamped to my drill press table, and then I'm going to clamp the skull in place. You never want to hold this freehand when you're drilling, especially with a Forstner bit this big, because if it spins or catches, it's just a safety hazard. So make sure you clamp it in place so your hands are out of the way of the Forstner bit, and then obviously make sure you wear eye pro when you're doing this as well. So I'm going to bring my Forstner bit down and find the center on my Sharpie mark. Make sure that's right where I want it before I start drilling. Now we can turn this on, and obviously when you're drilling this kind of stuff out, make sure you're drilling at a low speed. We don't want to generate a lot of heat. I'll make sure that my clamp is held down nice and secure. And because we're not drilling on a flat surface, I want to make sure to slowly advance the Forstner bit. The nice thing about Alumilite is the chips, it drills really easily and soft. Make sure you're drilling at a slow speed when you're advancing the bit. I'm going to stop the drill bit for just a second and clear the shavings so I can see. Clear the shavings. I've run out of travel in my drill bit, so I'm going to advance the table up slightly now. And that should get us right where we need. I'm also going to check my confetti light fit. And I want this to be seated in there to where the curvature of the glass kind of meets the curvature of the skull. So I've got maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch there to go. So we're going to slow down on the next few passes and make sure we don't over drill. All right, so now that I've checked my confetti light, I'm going to use my Forstner bit to help me find the exact center again. Make sure that bit goes in and out of the hole nice and smooth, and then I'll hold this down and we can start drilling again. All right, let's clear the shavings. Let's check our fit. Okay, that's perfect. I don't want to go any deeper than that. If you want to set it in more, you can, but I think that looks really good with just kind of the curvature of the skull and the glass. And then that way also it keeps the flame away from the epoxy as well. So let's go ahead and unclamp this. I'll show you kind of the height and depth we have in our confetti light. I think that's right about perfect. So let's go blow this off. We'll move the drill press out of the way. We'll get our table back and we can fill this with oil and light it on fire and see how it looks. All right, so we're back at the table and we have our skull drilled out for our confetti light. And the next step is to fill our confetti lights with oil, get them set into our skulls, and go ahead and light them up. The nice thing with the confetti lights is they do come with the funnel for filling. So I'm going to pull the wicks out. We'll set our funnel in place, and then this is just the paraffin lamp oil. I don't want to go all the way to the very top because the wick is going to take some room inside that jar, so don't fill it all the way up. All right. Go ahead and cap our oil bottle. We'll wipe out the funnel, that way we can reuse this later, and I'm just going to store this with the oil itself. Wipe up any spills you have, and now we can set our wicks in place. As far as the wick goes, it is adjustable, so depending on how much wick you have sticking out of the glass, it'll change the amount of flame you have. And I like about a 1/4 inch of wick, gives you a good flame but not being too big. Go ahead and set that in. And that's going to start pulling that oil up into the wick, and then we should be able to light that here in just a minute. I'm going to run this in and out of the glass just a little bit to help that wick, or help the oil flow. Get that pulling through. Now the wick is wet, so we can go ahead and set these in our skulls. All right, so we have our wicks and our candles filled with oil. These are ready to light. So I'll get my lighter. And get these going. All right, so we have a pretty good sized flame there. I think I might actually trim those down just a little bit. All right, so the flame was a little bit taller than I wanted, so I'm actually just gonna blow those out and then push the wick back down into the glass to reduce our flame size. Let's go ahead and get these lit. Check our flame height. I think those look a lot better. The flame height on those are nice and decorative without being too crazy. Now that we've got this project done, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Doing a little cast skull with a bunch of different colors and variations is a really fun project. These are some other ones I've done before. We have a nice purple one with some good sparkle in it. This one just has a bunch of spent casings in it. I think looks really cool. This one's got a bunch of different things you could do with it as well. You know, you could put an LED light underneath it. You could drill this out for a candle as well. I think those look pretty sharp. And then just some different color variations for you. So when you're casting, honestly, the variations and different styles of casting you can do are really endless, and it all depends on how you want them to look and how you mix them, the different pigments you use. It's a really fun process, and the cool thing is it doesn't take a lot of time to have, go from resin to a finished product. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below, but stay tuned for our next video. And today we've got a really exciting project for you. We'll be casting in resin a 3D skull. What should we call it? We'll be making our own custom cast resin skull with a bunch of different pigments and make an exciting, oh my gosh. We'll be casting a skull and then drilling it out for a confetti light. Sheesh. We'll be making our own custom cast confetti light holder resin skull. What's it called?